Consultation is a dirty, dirty, dirty word, or whatever, right? Consultation is about how to cheat the people and exploit them and use that as a tool for assimilation or perish in exploitation. It should be about negotiation and on our terms. And if it doesn't happen on our terms, it doesn't happen at all because you're not delivering on any term whatsoever so far. When I was at that university I was talking about just a minute ago, I took a pro-social policy of working with the inmates in prison. I had a lot of trouble trying to implement programs in prison at the university level, so I resonate with what Chris said and what others have said or whatever, right? Yeah, they're all too precious about having computers brought in and online technology and all that sort of stuff. So I had to work at pace or whatever I had to try and commit as many of them to a post-prison release experience and trying to get them into the university experience and education. But if we bridge people into the university experience, we risk low student retention rates. Bridging isn't enough. Bridging isn't enough. This is why I resonate with Brother Mervyn or whatever and what he's actually doing, because the mentoring that he does long term and doesn't disengage with people are the ways forward, But so I brought 140 people out of the prisons and some out of homelessness directly from the streets or whatever into university through the alternative pathway programs. And the majority of them were First Nations people, Noongars, most of them or whatever, right? And it also played into their early parole considerations, and that was a good thing. Getting them out of that situational trauma of incarceration is a great thing because, in my experience, there's a constancy of trauma from that situational trauma of prison. There's huge unmet needs in terms of hope and in connecting with ways forward, and that constancy of trauma for far too many degenerates into aggressive, complex traumas. And people come out worse than what they went in. We talk about deaths in custody. An abomination. We've seen what's actually happened. We can go all the way back to John Pat. We can go back to Eddie Murray and John Pat. You know, when John Pat was bashed to death by 5 police officers or whatever, right? You know, for going to the aid of his friend Ashley James, Roebourne became to Western Australia what Birmingham had become to Alabama. And those white coppers all got off or whatever through an all-white jury at Karratha and 3 years later. But he was bashed to death. He didn't die accidental death, he was bashed to death. But the rate of death in the first year post-release, as compared to custodial predicament, the rate of death while in prison, is actually 10 times. 10 times. In your first year post-release and the vulnerable periods in the first 12 weeks post-release in terms of an unnatural death, a risk-taking death, suicide, it's 10 times. If we lose 50 people a year nationally, 15 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders a year nationally to a prison custodial death, we are losing up to 500 in the first year post-release and 75 to 100 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in that first year post-release. We are stranding people post-release. We are disconnecting them from all hope. They are coming out worse than what they went in. They are coming out with less hope than whatever. So I brought 140 people out over the years into prison, from prison into university education. But I didn't just bridge them in. We provided them the psychosocial support that they needed. If I had to get them shared accommodation so they'd have stability, we got them shared accommodation. We got them housing. We got them what they needed to. If we had to support their families in terms of legal, health and welfare issues, in terms of the various advocacy that they needed, in terms of fighting those Serco-type mentalities that make up DCP, Department of Child Protection, with their minimalist and reductionist policies of just ripping away kids or whatever because there's no other solution or answer in their citizens' minds, or in fighting the Department of Housing to not evict them and resolving their issues with public rental housing, then we did that. If I needed to open up the sport and rec at 5 a.m. every morning on campus or whatever so they could have a shower, we did that. If I needed to subsidise the barber on campus, the hairdresser, to give them a haircut, then we did that so they feel good about themselves, feel empowered and validated. It goes to the psychosocial self. It goes to validation. We provided tuition from the point of entry to the point of exit, to their last unit of study. They became the highest student retention rate cohort in the university. The majority of them graduated. My data sets to this day, no one has reoffended. No one has gone back to jail. No one has gone back onto the streets or whatever. That's the way forward. That's how you connect with hope. You make it happen. If we're not going to make it happen and we drop the mantra of self-responsibility and talk about this victim of blame or whatever, right, that there's a narrative of victimhood, well, that's a load of shit. All those perpetrators of this narrative of victimhood, they should be shamed because they're coming from, whether they're black or white, they're coming from a position of privilege. Half the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population now lives well, whatever, but it is a meritocratic system. Half lives below the Henderson poverty line. and a quarter of them live in third world akin conditions, in absolute and utter poverty. In absolute and utter poverty. And that's the cohort that we are losing people from within. That's the cohort that we are losing people from within. There's a project in Perth, as I close up, there's a project in Perth called the First Nations Homelessness and Advocacy Service. I just want to give this as a way forward. In addition to what I heard from Natasha Mason, in addition to Nala Meyer, what I heard from Mervyn, and what I know from personal experience and all the people and the lives that he's actually changed and turned around, without believing, he doesn't believe in incremental change. He believes in revolution. He believes in actually the radical proposition. He believes in the way forward. He believes we can turn these people's lives around by being there for them 24/7 for as long as it need be to get them across the line or whatever, right, and support their families. I won't go too much into the First Nations Homelessness Project other than to tell you that the advocacy service these people provide, they're still unfunded too, and I'll get them funded, or to the best of my ability I'll try and get them funded. Hundreds of volunteers that have come together to address these issues have responded to. And Department of Child Protection, it has resolved 100% track record thus far of all kids to remain with their families, and psychosocially wraps itself around the families to support them in the most vulnerable, because the vulnerable are exactly that. If you're a vulnerable family, you're going to be vulnerable. You're going to fuck up. You're going to mess up or whatever. Right? What you need is the support when you're going to fuck up and you're going to mess up, and that's when you need people most or whatever. You don't need people to come in and surveil and monitor you and screw you over and compound the trauma and stress you out even more and take your family away. The most elevated risk group in the country to suicide. We know the population demographics. We know that the Kimberley has the second highest regional suicide rate racialised to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in the world. 80 per 100,000, that's my disaggregation, to the 92 per 100,000 for Greenland's Inuit peoples. That's 80 per 100,000. New York not far behind Cape York, and regions throughout the Arnhem similarly so. But the most elevated risk group categorical in the country to suicide has 4 times that rate. 320 per 100,000, 320 suicides per 100,000. If as a child, any individual as a child who was removed from their families, from their biological families, is the highest risk group in the country to suicide. And the restorative therapies and all the trauma-informed recovery cannot mend. And not that they're there. These restorative therapies and the counselling isn't there for them at this time. But even so, it cannot respond to the trauma of being ripped away from your family, being taken away from your family, when what was needed in the majority of these cases was actually supporting the families, helping the families, addressing their issues, validating them, working with them as human beings with human beings. Instead, we go in there and we just rip them away. As I said, we could release 3,000 people today from prison, and they'd be fine. We could work with them, or whatever, to address their poverty-related issues. They are the lowest of low-level offending. Of the 17,000 children that have been removed from their families, 1 in 18 right across the country, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, 1 in 18 children removed from their families, 1 in 10 in New South Wales, 1 in 9 in Western Australia, 1 in 11 in the Northern Territory and in South Australia. 10,000 children could be returned back to their families safely, so there was no reason to take them. Because of minimalist and reductionist policies, these families have been screwed over, and generations unborn will bear the pain of what generations today are bearing, for the pain of yesterday, for the actions of white privilege. And when I see DCP, I don't see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the power sharing. I see white privilege, whether I'm in a prison trying to fight and advocate with other individuals and colleagues for a newborn to stay with their mother, and then a dad take them over, or whatever, right? And or family take them over until the mother comes out. Or I see white privilege making all the judgment calls. I don't see a single black face, and I don't see a single black face or even the migrant face. It's all white. I know I sound like a racist right now, but I'm not. I'm talking about the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. I'm talking about origins of thinking that go back 100 years old, and I'm talking about we need to swell the conversations and not fear them. Not fear them. What we must do is be fearless in what we need to say if we're going to make the changes. This is not to offend corrective services who may be here today. This is not to offend the Department of Housing or the Department of Child Protection. But if we don't say what need be said, we should be damned for what we do today in a minimalist and reductionist and incremental way, as we damn the past for the segregation, the reserves, and the apartheid and all that went on before or whatever. Right? Because some of us believe that we can make change incrementally. The migrant experience believed that. And look, lost in translation are many migrants, and the children of migrants and second generation migrants or whatever, right, who follow behind Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as elevated risk groups to suicide. 1 in 4 of all suicides in this country, the Australian suicide toll, is actually a migrant, is actually a person born overseas. 1 in 3 of all the homeless in this country are actually migrants, people born overseas. 1 in 4 of all the homeless in this country are actually Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Our prisons are being filled just as much with migrants, more so with migrants than the non-Indigenous, the white population or whatever, right? That we don't have that benefit of white privilege. But look, there are ways forward. We've got to go more for a revolution, and we've got to go for a revolution of dialogue and discourse. There's a discourse that's actually happening, and the landscape is actually positive at the moment, but we've got to capitalise on that and keep them and hold them to account. And those who are in leadership, well, look, there should be a multitude of voices, and the strongest voices rise. But we don't need to sit quiet here today. We need to go with the ways forward. I'm not going to live my days going for accolades and awards and all this sort of stuff and career profile or whatever, right? Because in the end, it's all a theatre. It's all a theatre. I don't wear my titles. I don't wear any of that or whatever, right? Because we're all the same. When I go to my grave and my bones become dust or whatever, I want to go with the peace of mind that I did the best that I could have on this earth while having my time here. And it matters what we do with our days, because others are counting on us. Others with less opportunity than what we've actually either hit the world with and been opportuned into, and others have been denied similarly, so it could have been us. And you know, we're not the sands of any other desert, we're not the seas of any other waters of any other seas or whatever. We're all one. We're people. And culture will benefit most when socioeconomic pressures are relieved, when people are given the opportunity to navigate their two cultural settings, that of their own and that of the mainstream, and without impulse to each other. And culture will be enjoyed just as many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander First Nations people who are now privileged enjoy their culture. So too, that culture needs to be enjoyed by socioeconomic opportunity and at that level that is being denied here today. But what we need in the prison experience is transformation. Prisons, if people are going to finish up in prisons, even though I would have an amnesty and release the majority of them, and work with them in other ways. From the moment you hit prison, the situational trauma of prisons should not be compounded by a constancy of trauma, ongoing trauma, and a degeneration to aggressive complex traumas. From the moment you hit prison, the psychosocial wrap, the support needs to be there for people. The opportunity to access opportunity and to heal and to do the well-being and then navigate to opportunity, because there's no prison I've been to, Casuarina, Hakea, Cleveland, right across the country, juvenile detention or adult prisons, where people haven't put up their hands to engage. And it's broken my heart to see people presume that there's a brotherhood and a sisterhood in the prisons. There isn't. What there is just people corralling themselves together and holding firm, just like they did on the pastoral estates in the Kimberley, just like they did on the missions and the reserves. We can't leave them behind to rot, as we let so many behind on the missions and the reserves, thinking that some of us could get ahead at the table and change over time what needed to be done. We've just got to speak up, and we've got to do more, and we've got to argue within our organisations as hard as we can at the government level. And don't fear the media. The media is your friend. You've got to go out there and capture that media and nurture the relationship and get these stories out for social reach. Natasha's voice needs to be heard across the country. Mervin's voice, Chris's, everybody's voice needs to be heard across the country. What works needs to be invested in. But it's got to be a lot more than what there is now. Otherwise, we're going to sacrifice tens of thousands of people, and that isn't a right that we have, and it isn't our right at any point in time. It's our duty to do what we can do. I'm going to leave it at that. I know that I went off tangent with what I had intended to present, but I thought a lot of you just said it.